Okay, so I got a request from someone to show them how to put a bump map on something, and I'm going to take the opportunity to also show you how to put just a generic texture map on an object as well as a spec map and how you can actually make that enhance the way things look. So I've got a little rocket here. This just has sort of this is something I did a while back, but it just has kind of a basic, shiny looking texture map on it. And if I click on this guy in here, get this guy to show up. So this is what the texture looks like and how these different pieces are actually being used to apply this in a particular area. Okay, so if I turn on my Arnold Renderer in here, my window here, just to kind of show you what this means. So if I grab one of these pieces, it looks like it's this one, and move this around, you can see how that is adjusting and changing where this texture falls on the object. Okay, so having that kind of control is really helpful because then you can place something exactly where you want it to be. Okay, like that, for instance, if I wanted it to go over that row of rivets, like so. Okay, so this is kind of a general idea, is that you've got a square map here, and then you've got your UVs on this guy, which is actually mapping where that texture falls on the object. And they look kind of just like the polygons, but the difference is you can move UVs around and the geometry won't change. Okay, so if you were moving actual vertexes in the geometry or faces, obviously that would modify the way that looks. Okay, let's go back to object mode here. That's it. Okay, so I want to take this and I just want to dirty it up and make it look completely different. Okay, so I'm going to just stop this and I'm going to open up a new version because I have some textures I want to put on this, and I'll show you how this goes. Okay, I think this is the one. Let's see. Okay, so I've got some, let me show you these in Photoshop. I've got 3 textures, okay? One is for the color, okay, so that's going to go in my base AI standard surface. And again, this is going to map to wherever the UVs were that you saw on that sheet or on the previous thing. I did change them for this, but it's essentially the same idea because I wanted things to fall in a little bit different place. And then I've got a specular channel, okay, and you'll see this is black and white. Even though it's RGB at the moment, it's essentially a grayscale image. And the white and the black and the grays in between are going to dictate where light moves across off the surface of this object. Okay, so where we're going to see black, we're not going to have much light bouncing. Where we have white, we'll have more. Okay, and then the same kind of an idea applies to a bump map right here, but you'll see it looks very different. It's a much softer map. You don't have as much transition between the highs and the lows. So where you have black, that's going to be the low point, and the white is going to be the high point. You can invert that and go the opposite. Doesn't really matter. So when you put this on, you're going to be putting that in the geometry channel. And you can then modify how high or low the point is. Okay, sort of like a global thing. So if it's really popping out too much and you want it to be subtle, you can push that down a bit. There's a slider that's called bump depth. Okay, so you can use that to control how much of this is actually going to be influencing the object. And the reason you want these lined up is so that if I've got this rusty stuff here and with these pits and things like that, I want those to be, have essentially some depth relating to the color channel. Okay, and likewise with the specular channel. Okay, the specular actually goes in the roughness channel of the shader, okay, under specular, not under color or strength, okay, or weight, I should say. Okay, so I just want to show you what those look like so you can kind of see here what we're going to get out of this, okay. I'll turn on my Arnold shader here again inside. Okay, so I did stick this on here, and you'll see this looks a little different than the other one. Like I said, I did remap this a little bit, but you can see if I turn this up, there it is, Okay, so there's that color channel right here. Okay, and then if I wanted to look at the bump channel, I can click. This is the UV editor, by the way. It's under UV editor. I can actually see these, you know, if I want to look at the bump one, because sometimes you will have not the same image. You might have a different thing entirely in terms of the bump versus the color channel. In this case, they're directly related, but that's not going to always be the case. Okay, but I'll go back to color. Mostly that's what you're going to be looking at. And then the same thing applies here. So if I, if I right click over this, choose UV shell, and move this around, you will see, kind of hard to see there, but the texture changing as I do that. Okay, on top of there. All right, so I'm just going to pop that off of here, so you can see where these things go. Get rid of that. And I'll zoom in on this a bit so you can see it a little bit better. Or maybe I'll just open up the render view here. It might be a little easier to see what's happening. Okay, so here's that first one. Okay, just kind of as a point of comparison here. And I'm going to go back to a new one here. Render that. Okay, so I've already got the bump in there. I'm going to just disable that. In fact, I'll disable all of them so you can see how this goes. I can find it here. There it is. Okay. So I've got this color here. I'm going to just break that connection. I'm going to change. I haven't even put the spec in yet. And then for bump mapping, I'm going to kick that down too. Break the connection. Okay. So right now, all I've got is essentially the base standard, surface, AI standard surface shader here. Okay. Once you have a channel in there, something like that, this is just going to default to black. So if I just turn that back up to white, you'll see, kind of how this looks. So I made a little bit of mod on the rocket. I like that little shape better, and I wanted to put a glow on that red kind of dome thing in there. I think that looks much better. Okay, change the color of these. They were too purple before. So again, I'm always modifying stuff as you go. It's just more fun that way, at least for me. Okay, and then the way I map, the way you map something like this is you'll see that this is all one object. Okay. Like this. However, what I did was I selected everything and applied a cylindrical map. Then I went back and just selected the faces on the fins and applied planar maps to those. And what that does is that breaks them away from the existing map you start with. So you can break things down incrementally as you go without any problem. You don't have to do it initially. You can re-UV parts of stuff at any time. You can even pick things in the UV editor and say, make this a new UV shell, which is what I did for the little door thing here. And it's pretty, it's pretty straightforward. It's a pain in the ass to do that stuff. UVs are just always just annoying to have to deal with. But once you do, you'll see you're going to get a nice result, a different thing. And you don't have to do this for your final project, but some people are going to want to just put an overall bump on something. That's cool. And it's like if you have leather or if you have some kind of a grid on something, just putting a bump on there that matches it is going to enhance it considerably. So it's not a bad thing to just kind of get in the habit of doing, putting something on there. Okay, so you'll see how this is just really kind of bland here. Okay, like that. And one other little tip when you're doing stuff like this is that in the render window here, you can choose under render crop region. Okay, and I'm going to do that right now. That means you can draw a box here and it's only going to render that area. So you don't have to wait for the whole thing to render when you're testing stuff. Okay, so super, it's just way more efficient. And it'll just keep doing that progressively then as you go. So this other stuff won't get rendered, but the area that I want to see, which is where this light is coming from over here, will. Okay, so I'm going to go back here. I'm going to stick the color in the color channel. Okay, under base. So you go to color, you click on the little checkerboard, click file. Okay, and I'm going to then choose the file icon here, grab my file, which is corrosion C. Gets this one? Yeah, it's that one. It's my color. C is for color. That's just a way of coding these. Okay, C is for color, B is for bump, S is for spec. Like that. And you'll see right away, all of a sudden, I have something, more interesting going on than I did seconds before. Okay, like so. Now let me go ahead and then just sort of undo that so you can see what the bump looks like all by itself. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to my base here, break the connection on this, like this. Okay, I'm going to go back, I'm going to make this white again, and the bump goes in the geometry channel down here. So there's a thing called bump mapping here. Same deal, click on the checkerboard, click on File, and then you click on this little guy right here where it says bump value. There's a little output or input node here. You click on that, and then that brings you up to the file menu here, or the file node. And then I'm going to go and drop in my corrosion B. TX is just what Arnold makes when it brings in a TIFF. So it's more efficient. That's what Arnold uses to render, so it's going to make those automatically for you. I'll just stay with the TIFF so you can see it. Okay, and it's going to make it when you go. Okay, so there's what the bump looks like right off the bat. Okay, really wacky looking. Okay, super intense. Okay, right. It's like way too much. Okay. I'm going to turn my crop region off and then turn it back on again here. Because I zoomed in, I want to just see that a little closer. Okay, there we go. Okay, so it's going to render that. And you'll see that's too much. So again, like I was saying earlier, what you can do then is you can then go back to that file like this and click on this guy. That's going to take you back to the bump node. And under bump value, that's where the image is. You can't slide that, nothing will happen. It's taking the value from the picture. Okay, but the depth you can control. So you can drag that down. Okay, I'm going to set that at about 0.2. Even that's pretty heavy. And if you go to a negative number, it's just going to pop those out instead of bring them in. And so just to show you here, it goes the other direction. Okay, so if I wanted those to be coming off of the surface instead of going in, you go to a negative value here. Okay. And, you know, that's not that bad. Maybe I'll leave it like that, just for kicks. So negative 0.2, I'll just leave it at that. And again, these numbers are arbitrary. It really depends on your the bump map you're using, and the size of it, all that stuff is just going to, you know, change. If you brought in a normal map, you would put it in the same place, but you would click Use As Tangent Space Normals here. And if you don't know what a normal map is, don't worry about it. Okay, but you will see that in things like ZBrush, things like that. You'll export a normal map rather than a bump map most often. Okay, normal maps are a little more flexible and they look a little bit better than bumps, but for this, no big deal. Okay, so there's that. I'm going to put the color back on now and see how that works on top of this. Okay, so I'm going to go back over here, go back to color, click this, click File, find my file. This is my color here, doop, like so. And you'll see because those started out as the same color file, they line up perfectly. Okay, so that looks pretty decent there, not bad. Okay, all right, so next thing is the spec. Okay, and that is the one that is a little more complicated because it goes in the roughness channel, okay, under specular. So right now we just have basically a glossy highlight sitting on this thing, okay? And if we turn metalness up on here, we'll see that a bit more, okay? And you can see how now that bump map is changing where that light falls. And that actually doesn't look half bad. A little bit too shiny, in my opinion. But I'm going to then go to the spec channel here. Under roughness, same deal. I'm going to click this. I'm going to click File, load a file node. Click on the file I want. Click on corrosion S. That's our spec channel. Like so. And you'll see, looks like it's kind of like it did before. Okay, almost like nothing happened. And that's because nothing did happen, because what Maya and Arnold will do by default is they will assume this has an alpha channel, and they're going to plug in the alpha channel to this. Okay, this doesn't have an alpha channel, and even if it did, sometimes that doesn't even work. So you need to go to the hypershade here, this little guy right here. It's really simple once you do it. but it sounds really complicated. Okay, so you click on the main texture where you put that thing, Rusty Rocket here, and I'm going to click on this input output item right here. First I'll erase this because it's not going to look any different otherwise. So if I click on that, what that's doing is mapping all the textures and everything I put into this guy. Okay, so here's Rusty Rocket, that's this thing. And ultimately what all this stuff does is it all just feeds into things, and it ends up with something called outcolor, and it feeds that to this shader group. This is what's actually creating the render on your surface. What it actually is going to look like is this shader group. Okay, so what we're looking at, so we can see here the color one is linked. Outcolor of my image is going to the input on base color, right? And then my bump is going to the normal camera, which is where the bump falls. Okay, and then this other one, this specular one, so this is the tricky one. Okay, so this says out alpha, and see how this little noodle is going up to specular roughness. Looks like that should be right, but what we need to do is move that down to actually here. Okay, if you try to move it to color, it won't take. Okay, because that specular roughness can only deal with a single channel, not 3 channels at once. Okay, so I'm just going to use the red channel, drop that on, okay, like that. And if you lose it like that, it's real easy. You can just drag it out of here and just plug it into specular roughness. And you'll see it hides the things that need 3 and only shows you things that'll take 1. Okay, so if I click that, and you'll see immediately in my window here that changed it. Okay, let me show you that again. Just pull that off of there. Basically that disassociates it with it. Okay, so there's that metally thing. Okay, go to specular color here. I'm just going to drag that out to my red node here. Oh no, it's not spec color, I want spec roughness. There we go. There we go, like that. Okay, so now I can take this, I'll get rid of the hypershade, and this is where you go to connect things to other things manually. Okay, essentially that's what you're doing when you're clicking these node buttons over here, but you don't necessarily see it behind the scenes. Okay, all right, so if I start to crank up my metalness now, I will start to see a more subtle version of that metal effect. Here, let me get out of my crop region here so you can see this in a little more context. Okay, there we go. Okay, so metalness is really what you need to turn up to see what's going on with this. Okay, if I crank that all the way up, I get this kind of a look. Okay, which is actually not bad at all. And again, it's being filtered essentially through this roughness channel. So the other interesting thing you can do with these guys when you have these in here, which is neat. So under specular, if I go to my file, I've got metalness turned all the way up. Okay, zoom out a little bit more. You can see this a little bit more in context of the scene. You have a color balance setting, which is sort of kind of like going into Photoshop and noodling with different aspects of the file itself. But these can have some really dramatic effects on how that gets applied to the surface. Okay, so if I turn the exposure on this up, for instance, you can kind of see what happens there. If I turn the exposure down, I get this really highly, dramatic look, almost like we had before without the spec channel. But again, it has this nicely crafted inside with that spec going on as well, which is really, it's just going to give your look a more authentic look. Okay, you can also noodle around with the color gain and things like that. That's also going to affect stuff. The other neat thing with spec is that you can take this, even though you've got this guy plugged in, you can still affect the color. Okay, so if I click on this and just throw like, I don't know, red in, let's see, I'm getting this nice little tint on the edges of that. Okay, same thing with, green or blue or yellow. That's kind of nice. Goes with the rust. Okay, so it's a it's kind of addicting once you get these texture things in your head a little bit and you get some UVs to work with. You can really find some cool stuff that you can play with, just in terms of getting away from this kind of more generic look like this and into something, just a little bit more, I don't know, real, or more fun to fool around with a bit. Okay, you can turn the spec with this anisotropic stuff. All sorts of interesting things you can do with that. Okay, you can also turn the opacity down the bump, so it's not quite as heavy that way. So you can have some, other things showing through underneath a bit, like that. So as you see, you can really tweak this stuff a lot. Actually, I think that's the opacity of the object. You can do it back in your file settings too, as well, changing the exposure on that and the default colors. Anyway, there's a ton of things you can do with this once you kind of wade in and play around with it a bit. It's really kind of cool, fun, and that's when people start collecting textures. The other thing to remember is that you can take a color image that you've shot yourself, for instance, and you can turn it into a specular channel or a bump channel as well. And it's really not any more difficult than going in, changing it to grayscale, kind of tweaking it like, modifying the levels so it's not super high contrast. For the bump, you want that to be a fairly neutrally looking, a little less contrasty. The spec, you do want the contrast. And it's kind of trial and error. Some of it does depend quite a bit as well on the subject matter. But it's really how these textures were made, and there's no reason you can't do that. Of course, you can also find a bunch of stuff online too, tiled textures so that they repeat nicely, things like that. So anyway, I hope this helps a little bit. It's kind of cool, fun to do, and the hardest part is that specular roughness thing and going into the hypershade and changing where the node is pointing. Okay, so you want to move it from the alpha to like the red channel, and then that's it. That's all you have to do. And once you do that, everything's going to work great. Plus, now you have it on video, so you can always go backwards and find it. Okay, so give this a try. Again, not a requirement for your final project, but if you have time, not much, only 2 weeks left, go for it. All right, check it out.